link between local economic growth and living standards. And the context, in the sense, is that the government was elected with a mandate to deliver economic growth. Well, remember that back in June 2024, and we all know why. It's because we haven't had very much of it for the last 2 decades. But it's also been noticeable, I think, that since the late 2025 and now into 2026, that the government has been emphasising issues around cost of living crisis. That's completely understandable. The politics of it are there for us all to see. People really do want to see politics deliver improvements that they can feel in their everyday lives. But I think there's a slight risk in all of that, is if we see tackling cost of living crisis as somehow separate from the economic growth issue that the country also faces. Because without stronger economic growth, action on cost of living is going to be temporary and ultimately zero sum. You can distribute what's there, but you can't sustainably raise living standards if productivity and wages remain weak. Lasting improvements in household finances depend on growing the economy and making sure that people benefit from that growth. And this, I think, is where cities are an important part of the story. As you'll know, if you look at all our work, more than 60% of the economy takes place in our cities and large towns. That's only 9% of the land, but it's over 60% of the economy. And the differences that we can see between places across the country explains much of why growth has both been weak and uneven, which is a grim combination. So that's the context and the background for Cities Outlook 26, and as I said, our particular focus on the linkages between economic growth and rising living standards. And what we're going to do over the next hour is dig a bit more into those links and those relationships, to really explore where those links exist, where they don't, and why that is, highlight some of the cities and towns that are doing better than maybe anticipated and why that is and what they can tell us, and then begin to think about obviously what needs to change at the local level and at the national level in order for more growth, more higher living standards to be felt in more places across the country. So that's a bit of the context, that's a bit of the background. In a second, my colleague Rob Johnson, who's going to take us through the detail of Outlook, and he's going to use some slides, and that'll take 20, 25 minutes or so. And then Rob will join me along with my other colleague, Ant Breach, and we'll have a bit of a conversation, but also that will be the opportunity to answer your queries and questions. So as always, use the Q&A function at the bottom, put your queries and questions in. We'll get through as many as we can. If you see a query or question you particularly like, if you like it, that gets it to the top. That means that I'm much more likely to see it. That means we're much more likely to answer it as well. So that's how we're going to go. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rob. He's going to take us through the big findings from Outlook. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everyone to Cities Outlook. So we're going to talk about raising living standards across the country, felt everywhere by everyone, which is the government's mission on this front. So I thought I'd just highlight, a nice summary of what Andrew is talking about the change in messaging that was seen towards the beginning of this year. This was an analysis of the language used in the latest budget compared to the one before. You see an increase in references to fairness and maybe a slight decrease in emphasis on growth. So understandable change in political messaging, but shouldn't change the underlying growth mission to raise living standards everywhere. So let's talk about the lay of the land in terms of living standards. So here we're looking at disposable incomes. That is the chosen milestone by the government on assessing its impact on living standards. And that is, the proceeds that people across the country can spend to raise their material standard of living on things such as housing, on groceries, on leisure, and that kind of stuff. So this shows you disposable incomes across urban Britain. You see there's big variation there, ranging from just over 14,000 per person per year up to almost £28,000. So you've got this variation. You've got London about twice the levels of Blackburn at the bottom, and you've got these regional divides. So greater southeast cities on average have about 40% higher disposable incomes than the rest of the country. Now, if that description sounds familiar, that's because it exactly describes where we were almost 20 years ago. Same variation, same levels, roughly the same regional divides. And what these light bars show is actually that living standards, once you account for inflation, were higher, slightly higher in most places in 2008 on the eve of the financial crisis than they are today. That is both the case for our most successful places, places with the highest living standards, but also those in the rest of the country you see on the right there. And what this means in terms of, if you think about, okay, living standards and particularly where these things bite at the lower end of the income distribution, what this chart is showing is these average levels of disposable income across the horizontal, and then compare that to measures of local level deprivation. So that's the share of neighborhoods in the top 20% most income deprived in the country. And you see a very clear relationship there. Lower levels of average disposable income means greater pockets of those facing the strongest challenges to their standards of living. I think this is an important thing to highlight, because government's mission to raise standards of living everywhere is exactly the same as it being felt by everyone in these places. This is the majority of UK cities. You have to have an economy that can distribute the proceeds enough, before you can think about starting to change the size of the slices of the pie. You've got to have that pie big enough in the first place to share those proceeds more widely. So how did we get here? So obviously, economic growth is important for rising living standards, and I'll sort of whiz you through the performance of both these things since 1998. So in the decade before the financial crisis, each dot there is a UK city, by the way. You see increasing economic output, year-on-year growth, and you see the same for disposable income growth. And that all came to a halt with the financial crisis and the kind of 5 years after that. You see economic growth stopping in lots of places, actually the economy contracting in many places, and disposable incomes falling everywhere. And I think what these two periods show is that economic growth is necessary for rising living standards in all parts of urban Britain. Without it, you do not see those rises. And now we look at the period, let's say, after the aftermath of the financial crisis. Things bottomed out in around 2012, 2013. And since then, what you've seen is some growth recovery. So you see that there in some places, going up to relatively high rates of growth comparable with the pre-crisis trend. What you don't see is a return to living standards growth. That has been pretty stagnant. There's been some places that improved, some places that have gotten worse. But I think the thing to highlight there is that there's been a slight disconnect between economic growth performance and living standards growth. Now, part of that is just because there is not enough growth, not quite to the levels we saw before the crisis, but as you can see in those green dots, that relationship has flattened out. So there's been more of a disconnect between, growth performance and incomes growth. So let's zoom in on these green dots and think about this period, the slow recovery from the financial crisis, let's call it that. And we can divide that up into 4 different quadrants based on national averages for economic growth and incomes growth. And you can start to see some patterns emerge here. So in the top left, we've got places like Southend and Basildon, which have managed to grow incomes, but in spite of their local economy rather than because of it. And that is because those places and many others like it in that quadrant are more dependent on the fortunes of their large local economy. In these cities' case, it's London. In the bottom right, we've got Reading, which has seen economic growth, but the proceeds not necessarily enjoyed by its local residents. That's just a different model. People come in from outside and work in that economy. What we're interested in are those cities in the top right. These are cities that have outperformed the UK average on economic growth, but also managed to translate that economic growth into rising disposable incomes above the UK average for its residents. We term these in the kind of green shaded box as cities that have achieved greater prosperity over this period since 2013. And, I'll just linger on this slide for a moment because looking at the cities in this category, it's not just your usual suspects, which we think is really important. Yes, there's London and Bristol, but there are places such as Milton Keynes, Barnsley, Preston, Wakefield. So, what this says is that in order to improve and raise living standards, it doesn't necessarily matter your starting point. It doesn't necessarily matter which part of the country you're in. You can do it. These places have done it, and that offers lessons to all sorts of cities across the country. So these cities have got the ingredients right to raise living standards and reconnect that to local economic growth. So let's dig in a bit more on what these ingredients are. What are these places doing to improve, and actually what do our successful economies have that means that they can enjoy high levels of living standards? So let's start with the local economy, its strength, and that all comes from a productive business base. And particularly what we want to focus on here is what we call KIBS jobs. So that stands for knowledge intensive business services. These are things such as financial services, marketing, creative industries, that kind of thing. These are office-based jobs. They take workers' kind of knowledge and expertise as the main input into into their work. They tend to trade with the wider world, so the wider region, the UK economy, and even global economies. That means that they bring in money from outside and into the pockets of local workers. And these are our pink dots on this nice lollipop chart we have here. So if I draw your attention to the lollipops on the right, those are cities with disposable incomes above the UK average. They have higher shares of KIBS jobs in their local economy. What that means is they are more productive than the national average. That's the blue dots there. So they can produce a great amount of economic value with a given hour of work. This means that workers in these firms and industries can command higher wages. That's more money in their pockets to increase their standards of living, but also spend in the local economy, support those working in local services, and raise their standards of living. So that kind of sort of walks you through how a productive business base, particularly with the focus on these KIBS jobs, translates into high living standards in these places. And actually what you see is that the cities that have improved since 2013 have reallocated jobs to these KIBS industries at a faster rate than the national economy. So that's the starting point. It's all very well having a strong local economy, but in order to tie that to rising living standards for your residents, residents have to access the prosperity generated in these places. And one way of doing that is simply having a job in the local economy via participation. So here we're showing disposable incomes plotted against the employment rate on the vertical axis. That is simply the share of working age population in employment. And as you might expect, places with higher average incomes, they have more people participating in the local economy, meaning more, tapping into the proceeds there and allowing that to raise living standards on average. Actually, as you see with the green dots, these places are also more likely to have fewer pockets of income deprivation within their urban areas. And this is mediated by skills. Simply, do people have the ability to participate in the local economy, to get the good jobs, to put money in their pockets? And if we were to look at these cities in the top right of this chart, then they would have the lowest share of residents without any formal qualifications in their areas. So access is an important one. Can you translate that economic performance into living standards for residents? But it's not just employment and skills that bring access to this prosperity. There is physical access. Can you physically get to the centers of your local economy? And that is obviously through transport. So I'm showing you a map of Manchester here as an example of a place that's taken real strides to improve its transport networks. And, the transport in particular is an issue to tackle for the big cities outside of London in the UK. So this purple splodge you see here in the middle is the area that is well connected to Manchester city centre within a 30-minute journey by public transport as of 2025. What we know is that purple splodge has expanded a lot over the past decades. Manchester has massively increased its Metrolink tram network. It's brought buses under local control, first place to do so outside of London. And then it's tied this all up in its B network transport system to give you a kind of integrated, connected system, much as we see in TfL in London. And what that is superimposed over is I've coloured the neighbourhoods in Manchester as to whether their income deprivation levels have changed since 2010. So the green areas, they have seen material improvements, red areas have seen declines, and the grey areas, not much has changed. And I'll point you to what that shows is that the places that are well connected to the city centre, they are twice as likely to have reduced their income deprivation as places not so well connected. So here you see a demonstration of, improvements in transport in these big cities can help share this prosperity more widely across the city into neighborhoods. But it's important to emphasize, what is this transport connecting to? It's connecting people to economic opportunities, and that needs an economic center to connect to. So, and that's exactly what Manchester has had over this past decade. Its city center is expanding. It's added 40% more jobs since 2013. And if you look at the composition of those jobs in the city center, it is, in terms of the share of KIBS jobs in it, it is indistinguishable from London in that respect. So you've seen a commensurate improvement in the local economy, and that has allowed this transport network to connect people to opportunities. So we've talked about having a strong local economy. You talked about increasing access to that. Now, the next ingredient is making sure that constraints to these things, are not there, removing barriers to allow places to grow to their potential. I think housing is a really good example of this that we're highlighting in this chart. So as you might expect, more successful economies, there's greater demand to live and work there. And so you might expect greater housing costs. And you see that with this positive relationship in this chart. But, take a place like Cambridge and as an example of where these things might get unmanageable and end up actually harming your economy. So in Cambridge, the share of resident spending that goes on housing is about 18%. And if you think that as an average, that is going to be a lot higher for certain types of people in Cambridge, people on lower incomes, renters, etc. And not only does that eat into the prosperity of local residents, but actually it can choke off economic growth. If you think about it, restricting the number of people who can live and work in a successful economy and prevent its local labor market and its local output from growing. And, the danger there for places like Cambridge is, is this making it less competitive compared to other places with similar incomes, with similar opportunities, and what effect does that have on the national economy? And why do we sort of see this disconnect between housing demand and housing supply? Well, we know it's because of our planning system. It's discretionary, it's not rules-based, and so there's a lot of uncertainty. It's case-by-case nature. It sort of severs that link between supply and demand. It stops places from responding to demand and growing to their potential, and that can, limit the amount that the local economy can share more widely with its residents in terms of increased living standards. So I've whisked you through the three ingredients there. I think it's important to highlight what, give a concrete example of where this comes together. Now, I'll leave you in suspense for about 10 seconds, but we've highlighted here a city that has outperformed incomes growth and economic growth since 2013. It's decreased levels of income deprivation. It's got high wages, high disposable incomes. It is, of course, our favorite Northwest new town, Warrington. Well done for those of you at home that got that. And I think it's a good example to demonstrate how these ingredients apply, but also going back to the fact that it's not one of our usual suspects. And so it offers lessons to places across the country wanting to raise their living standards. So let's take you through what Warrington has done over the past decade or more. So its business base. It's got local strengths. Its economy is centered in its city edge industrial park, Birchwood Park. That's expanded a lot over the past 25 years, and it's home to a high productivity nuclear cluster. That has grown lots of different firms there, but it's not just building on this strength. It has attracted in other cutting edge firms in other parts of the clean energy industry, cyber, cloud computing, that kind of thing. So it's a local strength that has allowed it to diversify into other high productivity businesses. But it's not just, building on this one center. The council's been very active in trying to diversify its economy, whether that be in industry or actually physically in place. So it's got this development in the city center called The Base, aimed at building its digital and tech capabilities, focusing on smaller companies, startups. So there's been a real focus on the economy here. What we've seen is that Warrington, since 2015, has had the largest increase in share of KIBS jobs in its local economy of any UK city over this period. It's also done a lot to increase access to these centres of the economy. Lots of investment around the motorway junctions, around roads connecting to the industrial parks. That's access to local opportunities, but there's also access to regional opportunities. So Warrington West Station opened in 2019, much improved east-west connections to Liverpool and Manchester, allowing residents to work in those large labour markets, bring back the proceeds to local area, raise living standards. And for both of these, I'll highlight that a lot of this, about half of this funding has come from council borrowing, from private investment, not just central funding. So there's been a real active move to sort of get these projects off the ground and connect up the local economy. Finally, Warrington, in its kind of new town DNA, has always been very responsive to barriers, constraints to its growth. It's been expanding commercial space. Omega Park is a good example of that. It will continue to expand in the future. It's looking at the future Northern Powerhouse Rail, Bank Quay redevelopment. If that was to happen, that would allow the addition of a new city centre quarter with lots of high-grade office space, looking to attract in more of those KIBS jobs. And they're being proactive in responding to current and future housing demand, been releasing Greenbelt on their city edge to accommodate that. Only a dozen or so local authorities to have done these Greenbelt releases in the past couple of years. So what if we had more Warringtons? I mean, sounds like a silly question, but we wanted to see what if other cities had outperformed, such as these places in the top right, increased disposable incomes growth to the average level there. What difference would have that made? Well, what we find is since 2013, the average resident in urban Britain would be better off by about £3,200. And that's cumulative, that's adjusting for inflation. That's a real difference to living standards. And, it goes to show that there's real benefits from, reconnecting economic growth to incomes growth and looking forward to the future, looking at what lessons other places can do to get those living standards growth. So lessons for national government, for other places. What does the mission to raise living standards look like this year and beyond? So it goes back to this framing point. The messaging might have changed, but the underlying mission cannot and should not. It means getting economic growth again to reconnect that to living standards and feel that across the country. But there are also sort of more specific lessons, going back to our ingredients for raising living standards that we can learn from our successful cities. So strength of local economy, we've got places have published their local growth plans. We've had national industrial strategy from last year. If the government wants to raise living standards everywhere, we know it means that getting these productive KIBS jobs into city economies. And we know that for the industrial strategy to succeed, it needs to understand this place aspect and where do the kinds of sectors and firms that are in the industrial strategy, where they have the best chance of thriving and being successful. It's in our cities and our city centres. So it's tying that to the place aspect to raise things across the country there. There's providing access. The government has its 80% employment target, and that part of that will come through skills interventions, which will require central funding. But more importantly, this local flexibility for places to best match those proceeds to local skills shortages, and be able to work with employers on the ground and improve that access. There's also physical access. That means going further with transport devolution. We've seen strides on that in our big cities last year, and then the government can carry on doing that, bringing forward things like rail devolution and allowing these cities to have joined up networks to connect their residents to opportunities. Finally, it's making sure successful places can continue being successful and reach their true potential. That means picking up the pace of planning reform, incentivizing places to grow, and reconnecting housing supply to demand. Right, I've run you through that there. There's plenty more in the report itself. You can listen to the podcast. We've got a data tool. You can explore all the data and a summary in the blog. But I'll hand you back to Andrew.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Rob. As if by magic, my colleague Anne Breach has joined me. And with a little bit more magic in a moment, Rob will also come in and sit with us to just to reflect on where we are. So thank you very much for that, Rob. As you can see from the slide, and indeed at the beginning, a lot of the detail, all of the detail that Rob's been touching on is available on our website, cities.org, Cities Outlook, as well as other material associated with it. There's a data tool that you can dig into. Each place, each city that we look at, 63, has a detailed fact sheet that gives you how they are performing across all the indicators that we look at in Outlook and beyond. So there's a full wealth of information available. Quite a few questions, I think, already coming in about more information about X, more information about Y. I would point you to those sources in the first instance, and then if there's still more that you want or need, then by all means get in contact with us in the usual way, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I think that's super helpful. Thank you very much, Rob. He's now joined us. And I suppose, obviously, give us your additional or initial thoughts on Outlook. What would you want to add in or emphasize or stress, given what we've heard from Rob?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is the geography points, that regardless of where you're starting from, there's a chance for your city to get better by pursuing economic growth. But sometimes you see this narrative that it's just the rich getting richer, or the good things accumulate to the good. The Michael effect is sometimes what it's called. But what we're seeing is everywhere from Barnsley to Brighton can, if they make progress on these core things that we know are important for both driving growth and ensuring people feel it, that can translate into real improvements in living standards for people at every point in the distribution. Yeah,
I think that's an important one, because there's a question we've got in from Tom, which is, you highlight the places that are seeing much better growth than others. Is it possible for everywhere to grow like this? Or have we just benefited from displacement? I'll just come in on that, because that's part of the story about it's not only the usual suspects that we've identified through the analysis, which tells us something about different types, different models of economic growth that is available out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is possible because we've seen it, and we saw it in the decades leading up to the financial crisis. If you remember my chart earlier, everyone was in that top right corner. So it's clearly possible, and a big part of that is due to the fact that we don't have the levels of economic growth that we were seeing in that period. That, above all, is the first move you can do to bring places up to that level. And then, emphasizing Anne's point is that there are lessons for all across the country there based on what we know about the places that have outperformed. It's whether you're starting towards the bottom of the pile or you're already a successful economy and you want to continue to grow that and build on your success. There are places from Brighton to Barnsley to places like Warrington that you can look to improve those things.
And what we're trying to do always, I think, is try to think about and emphasise how do you make Blackburn or Burnley or Barnsley or anywhere else that doesn't begin with a B, how do you make them better versions of themselves? Not to say, look, Cambridge is doing really well, or London's doing really well, or Manchester's doing really well. How can you be a more like them? That might be part of the story, but actually it's also about how you can be a better version of yourself, and where can you look for some insights and some intelligence on that.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of the lessons for national governments, right? National government often gets caught in these tensions between, do we double down on the places where are already doing well and try to squeeze as much growth out as possible, or do we respond to these political imperatives to try and spread prosperity across the entirety of the country? And sort of the elegant sort of dovetailing of those two things is how the government should pursue an agenda that tries to improve growth in every part of the country, which means focusing both on these core indicators, but it also means giving places the power and the autonomy and the resource to pursue these things wherever they are, wherever they're starting from.
One thing I'd just add to that is that that's not to say, if you're thinking about national economic performance, clearly there are local economies that are more important for that. That's our big cities, which if you get growth right there, that's going to have big national implications. But for the smaller places, there are lessons for those everywhere. And if you want your rising incomes to be sustainable within your local economy and do what it has the potential to do, then you've still got to focus on those things in your local place.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. We've had a couple of questions, so again, quite a few on this sort of theme, just to emphasise it again, Rob. So Glenn Athy, Glenn, friend of the centre, good to see you on the call and putting your question in. Interesting initial point about the need to create wealth to share it out. Do urban areas that are still major laggards in performance struggle with wealth creation or developing tradable economies? Is it a common feature in the sense of association? So, there is this kind of point around if you don't have wealth, it's quite difficult to share that wealth out. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say. And in some places, that is the fundamental issue. I mean, they are partly deprived because there is no wealth or not enough wealth to go around.
Yeah, and obviously that starting point is difficult, and lots of places struggle with that. Which is why, if you think back to our ingredients, it's having that strong business base as the base, as the fundamental thing that you have to concentrate on is so important. In the report, and places struggle with it, but it's not impossible. And in the report, we focus on Barnsley as a place that maybe started towards the bottom of that distribution, but over the past 10 years or more has really focused on improving that business base in its local area. It started as a logistics hub, but the council has been active in trying to diversify its economy into sort of higher productivity industries and jobs. It's had a focus on its city centre, as it knows it should be the centre of the economy, and it's started that process. It's been rising incomes faster than most places, and looking to the future, it's got a lot of good plans to continue that rise. So it's not impossible.
Yeah. Eagle-eyed amongst our audience, we don't expect anything less. Talking about, if you make the obvious statement, Warrington sits between two large economies, Manchester and Liverpool. Obviously, not all places do that, but also you touched on, Rob, issues around Southend and Basildon, and there's a bit of Reading in that. Tony Travers has picked that up in his question as well. So it's sort of interesting. We focused mainly in the paper this time around how local growth connects into local income growth, how that sort of translates. But obviously, our broader work touches on making sure that people can access opportunities, whether they're literally on their doorstep or in somebody else's doorstep. And that's also part and parcel of it, which is the story about taking advantages wherever you can see them. And that's about the people of Warrington, if they can and they want to, going into Manchester to work, the people of Reading going into London, or the people of Southend going into London as well. So it's thinking about all of those kinds of things, which touches on some of the other issues that Rob raised.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of the answer to this is that different places are different, right? And they're going to have different advantages and disadvantages, and places will need to take different approaches to minimise the disadvantages and maximise the advantages. Certainly, you know, when we look at some other indicators, perhaps not looked at so closely in this outlook, we see in some indicators that somewhere like Norwich does well because it's almost because of its remote location, means that its kind of high street offer is able to capture a large swathe of the population within its immediate hinterland without any competition from any competing urban areas. So maybe kind of on the high street front, Norwich is doing a bit better. Maybe Warrington is getting some advantages on a logistics or a kind of an industrial location as a result of that. So I think it's fine and acceptable for different places to lean into each of their strengths. That's part of the argument for devolution.
Yeah, well, we'll add into that in the sense, yes, we look at what's going on in places, but actually it's the linkages and the connections between places as well that we need to understand.
Yes, definitely. You know, places like Basildon and Southend very dependent on London's economic fortunes, and if again back to the point that different places are different, play different roles in the local in the national economy. You need these big cities, their economies being able to do that very far and wide, so people nearby have that option to access opportunities in those places. And I think one point I like to make on the Warrington is in between these two cities. It's on a motorway, so it can sort of take advantages in things like logistics. It's the same with Barnsley. All places, places will have different variations of luck, different sort of starting points. It's about what can you identify these strengths and can you support them, but also can you not can you resist the temptation to double down on those, put all your eggs in one basket? It's instead using that as a leaping off point to diversify your economy, to sort of concentrate on these kids jobs, these tradable jobs, and making sure that you're in a resilient place, but you're also in a place where you can grow for the future.
Yeah, and just on that, because we've had, again, several questions about, crudely, and I'm paraphrasing, people will be much more sophisticated in their questions, but really, is it all about kids' jobs? Does anything else matter? Are we not in danger of putting all our eggs in the kids' basket, etc.? So just, Rob, you just say a little bit about kids' jobs do really matter. You talked about it in your presentation. That is quite important. But there are always spillover effects, and then how many kids jobs you got, or how many knowledge-intensive activities you've got in your place tells us a bunch of other things as well. So just say that, and then Anne can add as well.
Yeah. So we really focus on kids. We put it under this narrow definition, but it is a whole array of different sectors. So it's not necessarily you're over concentrating on one specific thing. It's anything really that uses sort of worker knowledge and expertise as an input. It trades with the wider world, which we know as a way to bring in money to the local economy. So focus on that is important in cities, and particularly because these are the kind of jobs that you would expect to locate in cities. And so these are the ones that cities can make the real movement on. And as we know, because it brings in these funds from outside, it's the production side of the economy, it's the basis of that. Your consumption in the end is limited by your production in the local economy. Yes, you can access things from outside at the local level, but that is a main determinant of that. And so focusing on that is really important as a starting point. If you then want to, okay, how can we bring in more people to access this prosperity? How can we remove the constraints? You've got to start with that productive base.
Yeah, so I think the key thing really is the focus on the tradable base, right? Having a strong private sector that's bringing money into the local economy. And that can be KIBs or it can be manufacturing, to keep it simple. The challenge, I think, for places and for policy is that while we are seeing productivity growth in manufacturing, we see that all around the world, that's associated with declining employment. So while it might make sense, certainly in the short and the medium term, to double down, or not to double down, but to seek manufacturing growth as a way of providing jobs, especially in places that have low levels of employment, as a long-term strategy, it's probably not a sustainable way of providing the prosperity of your place over that longer term. In contrast, KIBs, we're seeing both productivity growth and also employment growth. So it's a much more robust base for that those local businesses and that local prosperity that can support wider living standards across the urban area.
Yeah, that's a good point. Connection between the wealth creation, if you call it that, productivity, if you want to call it that, and how that plays out on the employment side. Those things are often in tandem, but sometimes they are not, and that's quite important. I think that touches on another issue, Rob, which you didn't go into the detail. I would highlighted it, but just to come back and emphasize it, which is about this sort of participation and skills bit of the agenda, which is yes, you need to create the opportunities for people to be able to take advantage of them, but actually then you need to support people to be able to take advantage of those opportunities, either by getting into the labour market for the first time or to get the skills that they need in order to then take advantage either to progress in work or to come into work. So just say a little bit about that, because we looked at that in a bit more detail and highlighted some places that were doing some interesting things.
Yeah, so the participation side of things, the access side of things is obviously really important to reconnect the proceeds of growth to local residents. And you know, can you participate in the local economy? Can you access the proceeds? But then also what that means is, you know, by basically expanding the pool of your labour market, then that feeds back into the economy, and so it feeds back into the local economy. What we look at in the report, we look at a particular case study, which is Liverpool, which in 2013 had the lowest employment rate across any UK city, and you know, relatively low levels of income. But what we've seen is a continued and intense focus on tackling the employment problem in the city region, focusing on skill levels, particularly bringing up the base of skills, so those with few formal qualifications. There's been use of central government funding, but also bringing that towards targeted interventions in the place. The city region mayor has been very vocal on this stuff, and what you've seen is this real improvement. You know, it's now about average in terms of employment rates in the UK cities, but in Liverpool, you've seen the greatest decline in income deprivation of any UK city over that period. So, you know, it's plugging more people into the local economy, but it's important that you have a local economy that can absorb those workers. And this is the key lesson from, I think, what we saw in the 2010s or earlier, you know, post-crisis, which we saw a big increase in jobs over that period, but not really the same productivity increases, which is why you see increases in work poverty and in child poverty in families and work and that kind of thing. So it's having that productive base and, you know, being able to give these people the good jobs they need to raise their standards of living.
Yeah, and as always, it's important to say, because you get this, we're not saying that Liverpool, as an example, is job done in a sense, and we're not saying that there are still problems and challenges that that economy faces and will continue to face. You know, however you think about it, you know, not in no ways are we suggesting that these things, you know, are a done deal. We're trying to highlight where we see progress, where we see moving in broadly the right direction, what we can learn from that, and what we can think about that, rather than try to identify, you know, the finished articles in any of this sense.
Yeah, and just to tap in on Rob's point about this productivity versus employment trade-off. Obviously, that was a kind of an important characteristic of the economy over the past 15 years, has been high employment growth, kind of the job miracle, alongside this kind of productivity puzzle, which policymakers have been trying to deal with. What's, I think, the challenge for the government is it seems that the initial indications we might start to be seeing a reversal of that, with some indications that productivity has started to uptick quite significantly, as well as exactly the same time that the labour market has started to soften and unemployment claims have started to increase. So it might be the case that we'll start to see some of this unwind.
Yeah.
And how this plays out across places is going to be very important for the government's economic agenda, but also its social and political agendas as well.
Yeah. Rob, we've had a question from Eva. The reason it's a good question, but it's also it's got an even better answer. So Eva sort of said, can you list specific transport investments that would most quickly expand access to good jobs for people who are currently locked out in many of our examples of our cities, and how would you think about that? The reason it's a good question, but the answer is buses, Eva. And as anybody that knows me, the answer is always buses. Now, what's the question? But it's a sort of seriousness to it, and you can see that already. But actually, we've done work, not in Outlook, but more broadly, which you touch on in Outlook, about how we can think about different types of transport investments, different transport improvements that can have large labour market effects, particularly for those at the lower end of the income distribution, right, who often don't have access to a car. And that's really quite important. So Rob, just say something about that.
Yes, it is a story of buses in our big cities. We love them here at Central City. So what we do know is that our big cities outside of London, they underperform on transport connectivity, especially if you compare them to similar cities in Europe. And, you know, a big part of the reason that that is the case is that its transport systems are fragmented between, say, trams, trains, buses. You have to use different tickets. The timetables don't sync up. Your bus never turns up on time. So And what we know is that that is severely limiting the effective size of these places, and then you don't get all the benefits of deeper labour markets, more people with access to opportunities, and so on and so forth. What we're seeing, thankfully, is kind of like a turning around of this this transport underperformance. We've seen, for instance, Manchester, that I highlighted, have brought buses back under local control, managed to tie that in with their tram networks and allow people to make these kind of joined up journeys to access a wide array of opportunities. And you've seen the other sort of big cities outside of London, they're making commitments to do so. And I think Liverpool's doing it this year, and we've got places like West Midlands, West Yorkshire doing it from 2027. And a lot of that movement is in the buses. Can you plug that into the wider network? Can you sync that up with rail journeys? And if you've got any other public transport, and actually a big part of it is, can you get the frequencies up so it's a kind of turn up and go service? You don't have to constantly time your day around sort of buses turning up or not. That lets people get into city centres where a lot of those economic opportunities are concentrated. And it's all tying in with this fact that actually the biggest movements we can do in our big cities to better join up people is not making the networks bigger, like big ticket expansions of trams or whatever. It's actually just making them function better. It's more efficient. Buses are a lot of the moving parts that can make these things happen. So hopefully we continue to see that over this year and next. Things such as rail devolution are getting a bigger ticket in these things, and actually in some places, particularly Manchester, are the missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to connecting up the transport networks and connecting people to opportunities.
Very good. And sorry, Mark, we didn't mean to upset you and say it's only buses. Yes, there's a role for walking and cycling, etc. But on a scale metric, getting our buses to be even moderately okay would have quite large scale effects for people who need to move around and even move around in terms of doing longer distances, notwithstanding e-bikes and all the rest of it. So we're not excluding. We're just looking for the big improvements in relatively short time as well. I want to touch on another issue, because what's quite, and again, several questions. So this talks about the policy mix, I suppose, and the emphasis in some respects is about ingredients, different ingredients. But actually, what's really important is the integration of the ingredients to ultimately make whatever it is that you want to make. Terrible metaphor, whatever it is, but you know what I mean. And that is really about integration, being able to think about what's the sequencing of and the relationship between different types of interventions. And we have been always long-term advocates for the fact that when you're really thinking about that integration, it should and can only meaningfully be done at the local level, and therefore giving places the capabilities in order to bring these different ingredients together. Rob, just emphasize that point, because it's not just doing individual bits that's important. It's bringing them all together that is absolutely vital.
It's getting the recipe right. I think that was the metaphor.
It was the recipe bit I was struggling for. That's right. You've got it.
It's exactly that. And we highlight these three ingredients. They apply at different levels in different places. I mean, at a very high level, you think about getting that productive base right. That mainly applies in places we know that are underperforming, that don't have the weaker economies. Designations, and actually by outdating the link between political and economic geography. That's not to say that some ingredients apply in some places and don't apply in others. It's always a mix, and clearly that kind of productive base applies anywhere, and you've got to always go back with reference to that, particularly if you're trying to bring in access to that, then you need that in the first place. But it's getting the mix right, and I think it's interesting that we looked at Warrington there. It's seen real improvements. It's still not solved all its problems. There are still pockets of deprivation there. What it can say is it is in a better position than it was in 2013. It has more resource available to say, okay, we've got this. How do we better divvy this up? How do we continue growing our economy for the benefit of our local residents? And it's about having those options and about having the resources that you can do these things at the local level.
Yeah. And come in on that, because I think it's just incredibly important point to make, right? I mean, the local leaders, local institutions, by definition, have the information, or should have, or can have the information that they need in order to make these kinds of decisions. That's calibrated over time, but also more reflective of what is needed in their patch.
Yeah, of course, the other factor in any good recipe alongside excellent ingredients is time. So we know from places like Manchester, like Barnsley, that this progress and these improvements we're seeing today are the result of at least a decade, if not more, of consistent and solid work, building up on these principles and trying to, incrementally get slightly better every year and trusting that it will add up over time. So rather than kind of, being torn about by political chaos or switching strategies or, completely turning the focus of local growth strategy in response to political trends, maintaining that steady course of improvement over time is just so important as places are to really feel these benefits.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Jumping around, Rob, but a couple of conversations or a couple of questions around almost the different spatial models of activity and then how places are responding. In a sense, Warrington, in some respects, its big economic strengths are in the suburbs or on the edges of the town. They know that, and then they want to double down on that and make sure that that can expand and develop. But they're also recognizing that there's a sort of spatial question about what the role of the town centre is. Similarly, in Barnsley, you can see, where quite a bit of that growth has come because of its location and access to network, to motorways, etc. Some of that is suburban and on the edge of town, but they've also had quite a big programme around town centre redevelopment and regeneration. So just say a little bit about how that's coming out and connects to both the emphasis to double down where you see what you've got and build on it, but also to recognise that you need to diversify and expand some of those other areas and some of the other issues. Just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so those places, they've got sort of the centres of their economy almost on the fringes of their urban areas, and that is just the economic geography in these places. And it's not to say that that's wrong or that will leave them in a worse place. It's correctly recognizing their strengths, which are industries that tend to need a bit more space, or there are these kind of pre-ready areas of commercial space that places can move, that firms can move into. Now, that's not without its challenges, and places recognize this. There's always a bit of a trade-off to do we go hard on these city edge developments when actually what it means is that people who work in those places don't necessarily have to live in your urban area or even spend in your city centre. And so that presents a bit of a risk to things like city centre high streets, to kind of shopping arcades, to footfall on those city centre high streets. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and that's why moves to centralise the economy, sort of bring things in more centrally, are an important aspect if you want to kind of support those footfall driving things. Like you and I, we've been up to Warrington, we've seen their city centre development. It's really nice. It's got an indoor food market, etc. It requires a kind of nucleus of a city centre economy in order to reconnect the proceeds that are coming from its city edge industries. People need to have reasons to come into the city centre, and doing sort of nice shopping parades will only get you so far. If people are working in those high value jobs in those places, then you're going to reconnect those ties. It's the same in Barnsley. They're undergone big city centre regeneration. They are actively trying to bring in more kind of digital tech sectors and firms in there with the scene development that is going ahead. And so they recognise this. It's a bit of a risk, but it's about building on your strengths, which happen to be at the city edge, but recognising the importance of those city centres, which we emphasise in our high streets work.
Yeah, and kind of thoughts.
Yeah, I think to just kind of emphasise what Rob has said, the key thing is not just to think of your city centre as a place of consumption. That there has been this tendency over many decades to think of, right, the employment land's going to be here, people are going to live over there, and then we're going to have a nice shopping area here. Even notwithstanding the technological changes that have affected retail up and down the country and changing demands for city centre space, as Rob has said, you need that connection between production generated in sort of essentially a neighbourhood scale within the city centre that can then impact and support that high streets, town centre, city centre consumption to keep that high quality offer going for your wider urban economy. That then feeds into the wider appeal of your place to people who want to move in for high skills, new specialisms, new investments, to support growth and high living standards across the city.
And it's a broader point which we touch on, which is actually when you think about economic strategies at the local level. On the one hand, it's about thinking about what you've already got, and have you got a lot of stuff that is in a growing market or growing sector, or in a declining sector, and you have to think about that. Just having lots of something doesn't tell you very much about the future. But as importantly, in some respects, is thinking about what you might not have very much of at all, or have none of, and to the degree to which you can get some of that. And too many strategies actually just go down well, we've got loads of this kind of stuff, we'll just get more of this stuff without making any judgments about that, but also what they haven't got. So it's just a kind of interesting perspective to have, right, and add in.
Yeah, and there's a good counterpoint actually in the Barnsley local growth plan, where they recognise their logistics strengths, but then they say, we know that this sector is most exposed to automation in the future, and that's why we're going, really all in on trying to diversify our economy and increase the complexity, increase the specialist capabilities that we can bring in there to future-proof it.
Yeah. And again, we've had a couple of comments, again, both in terms of some of the examples that we've touched on, but more generally, which is about, this is in the case of in Barnsley, some of this stuff, nearly all of this stuff didn't happen by accident, right? I mean, it required political leadership, local leadership, not just in the here and now, but over time, to be committed, to be proactive about trying to do all of this kinds of stuff, particularly if you're starting from a tougher starting position where you don't have the advantages of whatever it is, and you've got to really work hard for any extra pound or any extra bit of investment that needs to come into your area. You have to be really committed to doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a really important point, and actually I think that's quite a good point to finish on, in the sense that, as we've hopefully showed in this work, but in our work more generally, there are different opportunities out there for different places. Not all places are the same. Not all places should follow the same growth model, as tempting as that may be. And hopefully, at least in Outlook 26, we've shown some of the places that we don't typically think about when we think about strong performing economies, and actually try to understand a little bit about why they are strongly performing, or why they do better than we would anticipate, and what we can learn from that. So you can get all of the detail and much, much more on our website, centreforcities.org. I hope you found that useful. If we haven't answered your question, just send us an email. We'll try to answer it. If you're on the lookout for more information on where your particular city sat on one of the charts that Rob was showing you, we know where it is, even if it's not labelled. If you ask us, we can tell you if you can't find it yourselves. But as I said, all of that information available on the website, centreforcities.org. Until the next time, take care and stay safe.